The sky over Pine Hollow Cemetery looked like damp slate, the kind that swallows sound and turns breath to mist. I stood beside the casket with my palm laid flat on the polished wood, tracing the grain, as if I could memorize my husband's life with my fingertips. Edward Collins. 42 years, my partner in every ordinary miracle, was about to be lowered into the ground, and the town I'd known my whole life felt suddenly foreign. Our sons flanked me like pillars that couldn't decide whether to hold me up or fence me in. Ryan, the older one, wore a charcoal suit and a watch that flashed when he checked it twice in 10 minutes. Ethan kept tugging his tie, his gaze skittering anywhere but my face. Vanessa, Ryan's wife, stood at a careful distance, her veil just thick enough to hide eyes that never seemed to soften. The pastor's voice rustled over the small crowd, neighbors, a few church friends, the funeral director, but not the men from Edward's shop, not the handful of customers who always called him Ed, like kin. It was a thin gathering for a good man. Too thin. I held my breath through the prayers because breathing felt like agreeing that this was real, agreeing that a Tuesday morning and an ambulance and the cold language of a hospital could swallow a whole life without ceremony. My hand shook, so I folded it around the cheap tissue the funeral home had left on the folding chair. The tissue shredded under my nail. That's when my phone vibrated inside my purse. The sound was nothing a moth against glass, but it sliced through the pastor's words. I should have ignored it. I should have let whatever intruded stay outside the circle of grief. But my hands moved on their own. I slipped the phone out, cupping it low by my hip. A text from an unknown number. I'm alive. That's not me in the casket. Don't trust our sons. For a heartbeat, the world lost its edges. The headstones blurred. The pastor's voice tunneled. The casket swam like a dark boat on rainwater. I stared so hard my eyes burned. A prank. Cruelty grief. Talking through a wire, I typed with thumbs that didn't feel like mine. Who are you? The answer arrived before the last letter left my brain. Can't say. They're watching. Trust no one. I could hear the dirt already in the shovel. I could hear Ryan whisper, Mom, and Vanessa's perfume slid through the damp air like a decision had already been made. Ethan stepped closer, his hand hovering above my elbow, not quite touching. I looked up at them both, searching for something: shock, fear, guilt, love, anything that would break the smoothness of their faces. You okay, Ryan? Asked, soft voice, perfected for conference rooms and condolence lines. I'm fine. I lied, my mouth suddenly dry, just dizzy. The pastor nodded toward me for the first handful of earth. Doris, my nearest neighbor and oldest friend, slipped her arm around my waist. You don't have to, she whispered. But I did, because ritual is what you do when you can't fix the truth. I took the small shovel, lifted a scoop of Oregon soil so black it reflected the sky, and let it fall. The thud was quiet and absolute. My phone vibrated again. I didn't look. Not then. I needed to keep my body from folding. I needed to keep my eyes open until everyone left so I could still the shaking in my hands. Through the final prayer, I tried to steady my breathing, but a new thought had moved into my chest, and it would not be evicted if Edward wasn't in that box, who was, and if he was, who knew enough to write like him. Back at the car, the rain started, that thin Oregon drizzle that soaks you without the drama of a storm. I opened the new message with the door half closed. Go home, check Edward's desk, bottom drawer, false back. Don't tell the boys. I felt watched. I glanced at the far end of the lane where Ryan and Ethan spoke to the funeral director in low, practical voices. Paperwork, arrangements, costs. Their silhouettes looked like men tidying a problem. Doris squeezed my hand. Sweetheart, I can stay with you tonight. I'll be okay, I said, and believed it only halfway. I have to put things in order. Call me if you feel even a little strange, she said, reading more than I said out loud. I slid behind the wheel and stared at my reflection in the rearview mirror. White hair, pinned neatly lipstick, a shade too brave for a funeral eyes I barely recognized. Edward used to say they were cedar brown, strong as the trees. Today they looked like doors left unlocked. I started the car. The casket was still above ground. "If you're alive," I typed, "tell me something only we'd know." 3 dots pulsed. Then the penny jar under the sink. The first bike you learned to ride had a red bell, not silver. Our safe word was August. I felt my heart stumble, then gallop. I drove home. If this opening gripped you, tap, leave a comment with where you're reading from and follow. Your support keeps this story going, long before the messages before grief became a second skin. There was a simpler time, the kind that hides quietly in memory until you need it to remember who you used to be. I was 24 when I met Edward Collins. Pine Hollow was still a small, sleepy town, then full of gravel roads, wildflowers, and neighbors who waved even when they barely knew you. I worked cleaning motel rooms off the highway to keep the lights on for my mother, who was already sick by then. Edward ran a small repair shop near the edge of town, where the air always smelled of oil and cedar. He fixed bicycles, lawn mowers, and sometimes hearts that had forgotten what kindness looked like. The first time I saw him, I was on my way to the market in a faded green dress I'd patched so many times it practically held together on memory alone. He stepped out of his shop, wiping grease off his hands, his eyes bright despite the long hours. "Morning, miss," he said with that quiet confidence country men have when they mean what they say. "Need me to check your bike tires?" I didn't even own a bike, but I smiled and said, "Maybe next time." Next time turned into coffee at the diner, then long walks along the riverbanks, and by the following spring we were planning a wedding that no one believed could last. He gave me a ring that had belonged to his grandmother, tiny, scratched, and too big for my hand, but when he slipped it on my finger, it felt like the start of forever. We built our first home with the kind of patience that can only come from love and poverty. It was a 2-bedroom shack with a tin roof that sang when it rained. The floors creaked and the heater groaned like an old man, but it was ours. We laughed when the pots filled up with rainwater. We'd set them in the living room, naming each one like they were guests. "That's Bertha. She leaks the loudest," Edward would joke. When our first son Ryan was born, the world felt new again. Edward cried the moment he held him, and I thought if love could build a house, we'd never be cold again. 2 years later came Ethan, quieter, gentler born, with a smile that could stop my heart. We were a small family with big hearts. Edward spent his days fixing bikes and teaching the boys how to use their hands, how to respect hard work. On Sunday evenings, we'd pack sandwiches and drive to the lake where he'd cast his fishing line and tell the boys that patience was the real bait. I'd sit on the shore with my sewing basket mending clothes while pretending not to notice when he slipped me a wink across the water. Those were the golden years, simple, predictable, beautiful in their ordinariness. When money was short, we improvised. I made clothes for the women in town dresses with uneven hems, but they fit the body like love fits a soul. Edward sometimes bartered repairs for groceries or lumber. We never had much, but somehow we always had enough. He had a way of making everything feel safe. When the boys were little and storms shook the windows, he'd gather them in his lap and tell stories, tall tales about the moon being a silver coin God dropped into the night sky. Ryan would listen wide-eyed. Ethan would always fall asleep halfway through. Years later, when the boys became teenagers, Edward's stories couldn't hold them anymore. They wanted things our hands couldn't give: cars, sneakers, phones, a life that looked easier. They stopped fishing. They stopped talking. I used to stand at the window and watch them walk away, their shoulders broad, but their hearts already turning elsewhere. I tried to hold them close with Sunday dinners, with the smell of baked chicken and the sound of old songs playing on the radio. Sometimes they'd show up, sometimes they wouldn't. Edward said, "Let them find their way, Maggie. They'll come back when they remember where home is." But the world has a way of teaching children to forget. Still, through all of it, Edward stayed steady. He was never loud, never cruel. Even when the shop's bills piled up, he'd come home smiling, carrying a handful of daisies he'd picked from the roadside, because he knew I loved how they leaned toward the sun. "Everything'll be fine," he'd say, and somehow it was. I think about those years often, how he'd come home with grease under his nails, kiss my forehead and say, "You're my reason to keep fixing things, Maggie." I used to laugh and tell him he was my reason to keep breaking them. Now, in the silence of this house, I can still hear his voice echoing in the halls, that deep, patient warmth that made even hard times bearable. Before he died, before whatever really happened, Edward told me once that people don't really disappear. They just move to another kind of silence. That was before the texts, before the funeral, before the world I knew turned inside out. And if he was right, if people don't disappear, then maybe that's why I still feel him here standing behind me, waiting for me to find the truth he left behind. As the years rolled forward, the rhythm of our family life began to change. It didn't happen all at once, betrayal never does. It arrives quietly in fragments and glances that last too long, or phone calls that grow shorter each time. Ryan was the first to pull away. He was always the ambitious one, the kind of boy who couldn't sit still in a small town. He'd look at Edward's hands, cracked rough stained with grease, and say, "I'm not going to live like that." Edward would just smile proud and hurt all at once. "You'll find your way," he'd tell him. "Just don't lose your heart while you're doing it." When Ryan left for college, the house felt bigger. His laughter, his footsteps, even his old radio in the attic, gone. Ethan missed him the most. He used to wait on the porch every weekend, certain his big brother would come home. But when Ryan finally did, it wasn't the same boy who'd left. His voice carried the sharpness of the city. His clothes fit too perfectly. His smile didn't quite reach his eyes anymore. I remember one Christmas in particular, the first one where I realized something had shifted beyond repair. He walked through the door with a woman on his arm, Vanessa. She was beautiful in a way that looked expensive. Her perfume arrived before she did, and when she shook my hand, her fingers felt like glass. She looked around our home with polite discomfort, like she'd walked into a museum of someone else's life. "What a quaint place," she said, smiling thinly. "It must hold memories." I told her it did, though I didn't mention that most of them were built on sacrifice. During dinner, she barely touched her plate. She kept glancing at Edward's patched work shirt, the one he wore even at home, as if the stains offended her. Ryan noticed and apologized for everything that didn't need apologizing, for the house, for the meal, for us. That night when they left, Edward sat in his old chair staring at the window. "Money's got its hands around our boy's heart," he said quietly. "I just hope it doesn't squeeze too tight." Ethan followed Ryan's path soon after. He didn't want to repair bikes or stay in Pine Hollow either. He got a job in the city working with his brother, and suddenly the two of them were business partners, proud men in pressed suits who only called when it was convenient. At first, I was proud too. Every mother dreams of her children doing better than she did, but that pride turned into a slow, heavy ache. Their calls became fewer, their visits shorter. When they did come, they brought gifts that didn't fit our lives, an expensive coffee maker we never used, silk scarves too fine for our small-town errands. One afternoon, Ryan stood in our kitchen, arms crossed, eyes roaming over the chipped cabinets. "Mom, Dad, you should sell this place. You could move somewhere nicer, maybe closer to the city." "This house is fine," I said, trying to keep my voice even. He sighed like I was a stubborn child. "Fine isn't enough, Mom. You deserve better." Better. The word sat between us like an accusation. What he meant was different. Cleaner. Less like us. After they left that day, Edward didn't speak for a long time. He sat on the porch watching the sunset bleed through the trees. "Do you ever feel," he said finally, "like we built a house that our own sons don't want to come home to?" I didn't answer because I felt it too. The distance between us stretched, thin but unbreakable, like fishing line you don't see until it cuts your fingers. Years went by. Ryan married Vanessa. Their wedding was grand, all white roses and rented chandeliers. Edward and I sat at the back table, the one farthest from the head of the room. When the photographer called for family pictures, we were almost forgotten. Vanessa's parents smiled like they'd won something. Ethan stayed single but followed Ryan's lead in everything. When he spoke to us, it was with the same tone, polite, efficient, detached. "I'll wire you the money, Mom," he'd say when we mentioned needing new shingles or repairs. But he never asked how we were. Our family dinners faded away, replaced by phone calls about real estate investments and promotions. I tried to be happy for them, I really did. I'd hang up and tell myself, they're just busy. They'll come home one day. But home was no longer here for them. When Edward turned 70, I baked his favorite cake chocolate with thick white frosting. I called the boys, told them we'd have a small dinner. Ryan said he had a meeting. Ethan didn't even pick up. That night, I watched Edward blow out a single candle by himself. The light flickered across his tired face, and he smiled faintly, though I knew it broke him. "They've built their own lives, Maggie," he said softly, cutting the cake in half. "We taught them how." But I couldn't shake the feeling that in teaching them how to reach higher, we'd also taught them how to look down. And though neither of us said it out loud, something fragile cracked between us that night, not our love, but the illusion that love alone was enough to keep a family together. The first time Ryan mentioned selling the house, it was over dinner on a humid summer evening. Edward had grilled chicken in the backyard, and I'd made potato salad the way he liked it with too much mayonnaise. The meal should have felt warm, familiar, one of those small family moments that used to fill our lives. Instead, Ryan brought a folder of documents and a look in his eyes that reminded me of a banker, not a son. "Dad," he began, setting his napkin neatly beside his plate, "you and Mom should think about your future. This place isn't safe anymore. The wiring's old, the plumbing's a disaster. What if something happens? What if you fall? You should sell it while it still has value." Edward wiped his hands on his jeans and gave a patient smile. "Son, this house has been our future for 40 years. We're doing just fine." Ryan's voice sharpened. "Fine isn't a plan, Dad. It's denial." Ethan, sitting quietly until then, cleared his throat. "Ryan's right. You guys could get a nice condo near the lake. No maintenance, no stress. We could help manage the sale." I stared at them, two grown men in pressed shirts talking like real estate agents, not children who had learned to walk on these floors. "We don't need a condo," I said softly. "We need family dinners. We need you here once in a while." The silence that followed was the kind that breaks something invisible. That night after they left, Edward stood at the window looking out at the porch light flickering in the dark. "They talk about selling this place like it's just lumber and nails," he said. "They don't see the life that's nailed into these walls." He was right. The house wasn't just a structure, it was our witness. It had seen Ryan's first steps, Ethan's fevers the nights we stayed up counting change for groceries. It had carried our laughter, our arguments, our entire history. But the boys didn't understand that anymore. Over the next few months, the pressure grew, subtle but steady. They called more often, not to ask how we were, but to check in on the paperwork. Ryan sent a man to inspect the roof without asking. Ethan emailed us lists of properties better suited for your age. Edward's patience began to thin. "They're trying to move us like we're furniture," he muttered one evening, sorting through the stack of letters they'd sent. His fingers trembled slightly. "Something's not right, Maggie. They're too eager." Then came the insurance talk. Ryan called one night while I was washing dishes. His tone was smooth, practiced. "Mom, Dad needs to look into increasing his life insurance. You know, just in case. It's really for your protection." I dried my hands slowly. "Ryan, your father's fine. He still works every day." "Exactly," he said quickly. "And that's dangerous at his age. Just talk to him, okay? It would make everyone feel safer." When I told Edward, he frowned. "My own son wants me to bet against my life." He chuckled, but there was no humor in it. "I don't like it, Maggie. Not one bit." He agreed to look at the policy anyway, though I could tell it made him uneasy. A few days later, papers arrived in the mail. New terms, higher coverage, and unfamiliar signatures that made Edward's jaw tighten. "He must have started the process already," he said quietly, scanning the fine print, without asking me. That night I woke up to find him sitting at the kitchen table, the papers spread before him. He was writing something in his small, careful script. When I asked what it was, he just smiled sadly. "Notes, for when I can't remember what I already know." He folded them into an envelope and slid it into his desk drawer. I didn't ask again. A week later, Ryan stopped by the shop. He brought coffee for Edward and spent the whole morning there. When he came home that evening, Edward looked pale, shaken. He didn't say much, just that Ryan wanted him to sign a few things. He said it was for business modernization, whatever that means, Edward told me. but I didn't sign. "Good," I said, though my heart was pounding. "You shouldn't." "Something's off," he whispered. "I can feel it in my bones." It was the first time I saw fear in his eyes, not the kind that comes from age or illness, but from betrayal. A few days later, Ethan called with the same gentle insistence. "Dad, you should really let Ryan handle the paperwork. He knows how to deal with this stuff. You've worked too hard for too long." Edward's voice hardened. "You boys worry too much about my work and not enough about your own souls." He hung up, but afterward he just sat in silence. That evening, as the sun dipped behind the pines, he turned to me and said, "Maggie, if anything happens to me, anything strange, don't believe it was an accident. Promise me you'll look deeper." I tried to brush it off as worry. I kissed his forehead and told him not to talk like that, but his eyes stayed fixed on the window, reflecting the orange glow of the fading day. "Promise me," he repeated. And I did. I just never thought I'd have to keep that promise so soon. The morning it happened began like any other. Edward was up before sunrise, humming to himself in the kitchen while the coffee brewed. The smell drifted down the hallway, warm and familiar. I remember smiling to myself, thinking how the rhythm of our mornings hadn't changed in 40 years, the same whistle of the kettle, the same slow shuffle of his boots on the old wooden floor. He kissed me on the cheek before leaving his breath faintly sweet with coffee. "Don't forget Maggie," he said softly. "I'll be home early for lunch." He always said that, even though early usually meant 2 or 3 in the afternoon. But that morning, his voice carried a strange tenderness, as if he were saying goodbye instead of see you later. I didn't think much of it then. Around 10 o'clock, the phone rang. I almost didn't answer because my hands were covered in flour. I'd been kneading dough for his favorite meatloaf. But something in the way it rang, sharp, unrelenting, made my stomach twist. "Mrs. Collins," a voice said. It was calm, but strained. "This is Memorial Hospital. Your husband's been in an accident. You need to come immediately." The world went still. My heart felt like it had stopped mid-beat. "What kind of accident?" I managed to ask. "Is he—" "Please come as soon as possible," the nurse said. "He's in critical condition." I don't remember how I got to the hospital. My neighbor Doris said I showed up at her door trembling, clutching the phone like it was proof of something terrible. She drove while I sat silent beside her, staring out the window, unable to form words. When we reached the hospital, I saw Ryan and Ethan already in the waiting area. That struck me immediately. No one had called them yet, at least not me. But in that haze of fear, I didn't have room for suspicion. Ryan stood up the moment he saw me. His eyes were red, but his composure was unsettling. "Mom," he said softly, putting a hand on my shoulder. "Dad's hurt bad. They said something exploded in the shop." "An explosion," I repeated. "That's impossible. He checks every machine twice a day." Ethan avoided my eyes, his voice low. "It was an accident. They said, it happens." Accident. The word didn't sit right. Edward had always been careful, meticulous. He used to double-check the wiring before turning on any machine. He'd say safety's just love in another form. A nurse led us to the intensive care unit. I barely recognized him when I saw him bandaged from head to toe, tubes in his mouth machines beeping in a cruel rhythm that pretended to be life. His face was swollen, his skin burned in patches. I had to hold the bed rail to keep from collapsing. I took his hand, the only part of him not wrapped in gauze. "Edward," I whispered, "I'm here." For a moment I thought I imagined it, a small twitch, his fingers squeezing mine. His eyes fluttered behind the lids. The nurse said it was a reflex, but I knew better. He was fighting to reach me. The next 3 days blurred into each other. I slept in a chair by his bedside, half awake, counting every breath. Ryan and Ethan came and went, whispering to doctors in corners. I caught fragments: insurance policy coverage, beneficiary, words that didn't belong in a hospital room. Once Ryan leaned over me while I dozed and said quietly, "Mom, we looked into Dad's policy. You'll be taken care of, I promise." I opened my eyes. "He's not gone," I snapped. "Don't talk like that." He smiled faintly as if humoring a child. "Of course, Mom." By the 3rd night, Edward's condition worsened. The doctor, a man with tired eyes, called me into a small office. "Mrs. Collins." He began gently. "Your husband's injuries are extensive. The burns have caused severe infection and his brain activity is minimal." I shook my head. "He'll wake up. He's strong." He sighed. "You should prepare yourself for the possibility that he won't." I went back to the room and sat beside him. "You promised you'd come home early for lunch," I whispered, pressing my forehead against his bandaged hand. "You promised." The machines beeped on, indifferent. Around dawn, I drifted into a half-sleep. Then came the sound, sharp, shrill, final. The alarms screamed. Nurses rushed in. I stumbled backward as they worked their voices blurring into a single desperate plea to the universe. At 4:37 a.m., Edward Collins was pronounced dead. The doctor's words washed over me like water over stone. My knees buckled and I clung to the edge of the bed. Ryan's voice came from somewhere far away. "Mom, it's better this way. He's at peace now." At peace. He was gone. My husband, my anchor, the man who fixed everything, had left me in a world that suddenly made no sense. But what I didn't know, what none of us would admit yet, was that death had not been the end. It had only been the beginning of something far darker, something carefully planned by the people I had trusted most, and within days, the first cracks in their story would begin to show. The morning of the funeral arrived gray and breathless, the kind of day where even the air seems to hold its sorrow. Pine Hollow Cemetery lay under a thin mist, and the ground was still soft from last night's rain. I wore the only black dress I owned, the same one I'd worn when my mother passed. Doris helped me fasten the buttons on the back. My hands wouldn't stop trembling. When we reached the cemetery, I expected a crowd. Edward had fixed half the town's bikes and tractors, given free repairs to kids who couldn't pay Lent tools to anyone who asked. But there were only a few faces that morning: Doris, the pastor Ryan, and Ethan and Vanessa, who stood slightly apart with her umbrella tilted like a shield. Something inside me tightened. The absence of Edward's friends, the quickness with which everything had been arranged, it all felt wrong. Ryan had insisted on handling the details. "You shouldn't have to worry about anything, Mom," he'd said. "Dad would have wanted it simple." Simple, yes. But this felt rushed, stripped of warmth. Even the casket was the plainest kind, unvarnished wood, no flowers. I wanted to protest, to slow everything down, to make time stop long enough for me to believe any of it was real. The pastor's voice floated above the wind, offering words about peace, about eternal rest. I barely heard him. My eyes stayed fixed on the casket, trying to will it open. Somewhere in the crowd, Ethan sniffled quietly. Ryan stood rigid, his expression unreadable. When it came time for me to step forward, I froze. My body wouldn't obey. Doris had to guide me closer, whispering, "Just a handful of soil, Maggie. He'd want you to." I took the shovel, my hand shaking so hard the metal clattered against the rim. The dirt fell in a dull thud, final and cruel. That's when it happened. My phone buzzed in my purse, a single vibration that jolted through my spine. Instinctively, I pulled it out, shielding the screen behind my coat. The message was from an unknown number. "I'm alive. That's not me in the casket. Don't trust our sons." For a heartbeat, I couldn't breathe. The world tilted, blurred. My fingers went cold. It couldn't be real. Edward was gone. I had touched his hand in the hospital, seen the color drain from his skin. I told myself it was a cruel joke, a mistake, some glitch of grief, but my heart was pounding so violently, it felt like truth. I typed back, "Who are you?" The reply came almost instantly. "I can't say. They're watching. Trust no one." The phone nearly slipped from my hand. I caught it, shoving it back into my purse before anyone noticed. When I looked up, Ryan was watching me. His brows lifted slightly. "You okay, Mom?" "I'm fine," I said quickly, forcing a smile. "Just dizzy." He nodded, but something in his gaze lingered, sharp, measuring. The rest of the service passed in a blur. I remember the sound of dirt hitting the wood, the rustle of leaves, the pastor's final amen. Then hands, cold, formal, shaking mine, offering condolences that dissolved before they reached my heart. Back home, the silence was unbearable. The house felt too large without Edward's footsteps, too still without his humming. I walked from room to room, tracing the outlines of our life together, his coffee cup on the counter, the dent in his chair cushion his jacket still hanging by the door. The phone buzzed again. Check Edward's desk. Bottom drawer. False back. Don't tell the boys. I hesitated, staring at the message until the letters blurred. My breath came shallow. Then, before fear could talk me out of it, I went to his small workshop in the back room. The air still smelled faintly of sawdust and oil. The desk was old solid oak, scratched from decades of use. I pulled open the bottom drawer papers, receipts, tools. Nothing unusual, but when I felt along the back, my fingers brushed against a seam. I pried it loose. Behind the false panel was a small envelope with my name written in Edward's careful handwriting. Inside was a folded note, yellowed at the edges, dated 3 days before his accident. Ryan keeps pushing for more insurance. Says it's for you, Maggie, but I'm not sure. Ethan brought papers I don't understand. Something doesn't feel right. If anything happens to me, look closer. Don't trust what they tell you. My knees gave way, and I sank onto the floor. The paper trembled in my hands as if it were alive. He'd known. The thought hit me like lightning. Edward had sensed danger, had tried to warn me. And the messages, whoever was sending them, knew too much to be a coincidence. A car door slammed outside. I jumped, heart racing. Through the window, I saw Ryan and Ethan stepping out, talking in low voices. They'd come without calling. I slipped the note back into the drawer and replaced the panel just as the front door opened. Mom, Ryan called out, his tone bright but rehearsed. We thought we'd stop by to check on you. Their footsteps approached. I smoothed my hair, forced a calm I didn't feel. If Edward's message was real, if this warning was true, then I was sitting in a house with the very people I could no longer trust. And the only man who could tell me the truth was supposed to be dead. Ryan and Ethan sat in the living room that evening, pretending to be sons visiting a grieving mother. But everything about them felt wrong now, their posture too formal, their smiles too practiced. I poured coffee out of habit, though my hands were trembling. The clink of the porcelain cups was the only sound filling the space between us. Ryan leaned forward, elbows on his knees, concern painted perfectly across his face. Mom, we've been talking, he began gently, and we think you should consider moving out of this house. It's too much for you alone. Too many memories. Too many memories. The words tasted like acid. Ethan nodded in quiet agreement, his fingers tracing the edge of his cup. There are some really nice retirement places by the lake. Peaceful, safe. You'd have people around you. I stared at them both, wondering if they could hear the echo of Edward's voice inside my head. If anything happens to me, look closer. I'm fine here, I said evenly. Your father built this house for us. It's where I belong. Ryan exchanged a glance with Ethan, a flicker of frustration crossing his eyes. Mom, you can't live in the past. Dad wouldn't want that. The irony of that statement made my throat tighten. If the message was true, if Edward was alive, or if someone knew what had really happened, then even the past they spoke of was a lie. When they left an hour later, I sat in Edward's old chair, clutching his note like a lifeline. The sound of their car fading down the dirt road was the only proof I was still alone. My body shook with exhaustion, but my mind wouldn't stop racing. The next morning I returned to his workshop. Sunlight filtered through the small window dust dancing in the beam. I opened the desk again, checking every compartment this time. Behind a small box of screws, I found another folded paper, a receipt from the bank dated 2 months before his death. A large withdrawal, $3,000. Edward never touched our savings without telling me. Something was deeply wrong. I grabbed my purse and drove to Pine Hollow Savings and Trust, the small bank we'd used since our wedding day. Mrs. Thompson, the manager, had known us for decades. When she saw me, her face softened. Margaret, I'm so sorry about Edward. He was one of the good ones. Thank you, I said quietly. I need to look over our account statements from the last few months, just to settle things. She nodded, pulled up the records and handed me a printed list. My heart sank as I scanned the numbers. There had been withdrawals, not one but several, all signed with Edward's name. $1,000 in January, $3,000 in February, $4,000 in March. That can't be right, I whispered. Edward never withdrew that kind of money. What did he say it was for? Mrs. Thompson frowned. He mentioned repairs at the shop. Said one of your sons was helping him with the paperwork because he'd forgotten his glasses. My stomach turned. Which son? I believe it was Ryan, she said. He signed one of the forms as a witness. The room spun. I held onto the edge of the counter to steady myself. Thank you, Mrs. Thompson, I murmured, managing a weak smile. I walked out into the cold morning air, my breath visible in front of me. The puzzle pieces were beginning to fit, and the picture they made was monstrous. Ryan had been withdrawing money under Edward's name. He had manipulated his own father, the same man who taught him how to ride a bike, how to tie a fishing knot, into signing away his own savings. That night, I couldn't sleep. I sat in the dark with only the ticking of the wall clock for company. Then, as if summoned by my thoughts, my phone buzzed on the table, the same unknown number. Check the insurance papers. He didn't sign willingly. My breath caught. I hurried to Edward's filing box and pulled out the life insurance documents. They looked official, dense print, bold numbers, $50 $1,000 in coverage, but the signature, it was trembling, unsure. I'd seen Edward's handwriting for decades, and this wasn't his hand. I stared at the papers until the ink blurred through tears. Whoever had done this had taken everything sacred in our lives, trust, love, family, and turned it into a weapon. When I finally looked up, dawn had crept through the curtains. The light was pale, merciless, revealing every detail of my kitchen, the chipped mug, the unpaid bills, the clock still ticking toward nothing. The doorbell rang suddenly. I froze. Through the window, I saw Ryan's car pulling up the driveway again. He never came 2 days in a row. He stepped inside without waiting for me to answer. Mom. I brought breakfast, he said, setting a paper bag on the counter. His voice was gentle, but his eyes darted toward the hallway, toward Edward's workshop. I felt the letter in my pocket, the one that could expose him. My heart pounded. That's thoughtful of you, I said carefully. But I'm not hungry. He smiled, though it didn't reach his eyes. You need to keep your strength up. You've been through a lot. Something inside me hardened. I met his gaze for the first time, really met it. Yes, I said slowly. I have. He blinked, unsure how to respond. Ryan, I asked softly, did your father ever tell you he didn't trust the insurance changes? The color drained from his face, just for a second, but it was enough. Then his expression smoothed, the charm sliding back into place. Mom, you're tired. You shouldn't be worrying about that stuff. Let me handle it. He patted my shoulder, but his touch felt like a trap. After he left, I locked the door behind him and leaned against it, breathless. The mask had slipped only for a moment, but I had seen what hid beneath it. The sons I had raised with love had become strangers, and one of them, maybe both, had taken their father's life. By the end of that week, the air inside the house had changed. It no longer smelled like coffee and cedar the way it used to when Edward worked in the shop. It smelled of fear, sharp metallic, impossible to ignore. Every sound made me flinch, the creak of the porch boards, the groan of the heater, even the wind against the windows. I had stopped answering the phone. The calls came too often, always from numbers I didn't recognize, and I couldn't tell anymore which voice belonged to concern and which to threat. Instead, I waited for the text messages from the unknown number, the only connection that still felt honest. On Thursday night, another one came. They know you're suspicious. Don't eat or drink anything they give you. Act normal. Help is coming. My hands trembled as I read it. I didn't know who was sending them, whether it was Edward or someone acting on his behalf, but whoever it was, they knew too much to be guessing. The next morning, a knock at the door pulled me from the kitchen. When I opened it, Ryan stood there smiling like an actor playing a part. Ethan and Vanessa were behind him carrying a white bakery box and a thermos. Surprise, Mom, Ryan said, voice bright. We brought breakfast. Your favorite cinnamon rolls and that caramel coffee you love. The smell hit me immediately, sweet, buttery, comforting, but the warning from the message pulsed in my mind. Don't eat or drink anything they give you. I forced a small smile. That's kind of you, I said, stepping aside. Come in. They entered like a well-rehearsed trio. Vanessa went straight to the kitchen, arranging the pastries on a plate as if she lived here. Ethan poured coffee into my mug without asking. His movements were quick, mechanical. Mom, Ryan said softly, pulling out a chair for me, "You've been isolating yourself. We're worried. Doris said you haven't been eating properly." I froze. Doris would never say that. She'd been my friend for 40 years, which meant they'd been talking to someone else or making things up to sound caring. "I've had an appetite," I lied, sitting slowly. "Just not for sweets lately." Ethan slid the cup toward me. "Drink, at least. You need something warm." I met his eyes. There was no warmth in them, only impatience. "Thank you," I murmured, wrapping my hands around the mug but not bringing it to my lips. Vanessa sat across from me, smiling that polite, empty smile. "You've lost weight, Mrs. Collins. You really must take better care of yourself." Something inside me snapped at the sound of her voice, the way she used Mrs. Collins instead of Mom, like she couldn't let the word touch her mouth. Ryan leaned back, studying me. "Mom, there's something we should discuss," he began carefully. "We've spoken to a doctor. He's worried about your memory." "My memory," I repeated, though I already knew where this was going. "You've been confused lately," he continued. "You've been saying strange things, asking about Dad's insurance, the accident report, things that aren't good for you to dwell on." Ethan added quickly, "We just want to help you, Mom. We found a place, a beautiful care home. They'll take great care of you." My pulse thudded in my ears. "A care home?" Ryan nodded, his tone gentle, but his eyes gleaming with calculation. "It's temporary, just until you feel like yourself again. The doctor even said he could sign the papers." "What doctor?" Dr. Albright. Vanessa answered smoothly. "He specializes in geriatric psychology. He thinks you might be suffering from paranoia." The word landed like a slap. I rose slowly, steadying myself on the back of the chair. "I'm not paranoid," I said quietly. "I'm grieving." Ryan sighed the way he used to when he didn't get his way as a child. "Mom, please don't make this harder than it needs to be. We're trying to protect you. Protect me." "From what?" "From the truth." From their guilt, I took a step back. "You think you can take my house, my money, and now my sanity?" Ethan's face tightened. "This isn't about money." "Then what is it about?" I snapped. "Because ever since your father died, all you've done is talk about selling the house, the insurance, the estate. You organized his funeral before I could even breathe. You didn't even let me pick his casket." Silence. Vanessa looked down at her hands, perfectly manicured, perfectly still. Ryan's mask slipped then. For a brief second, I saw the truth behind his calm, something sharp and desperate, something that looked like fear dressed up as authority. "If you won't cooperate," he said coldly, "we'll have to take legal steps." The doctor already signed the preliminary report. "It'll be easy to prove you're unfit." My heart stopped. "You would do that to your own mother?" His eyes didn't blink. "We'd do what's necessary." I stood there gripping the edge of the table, trying to keep from shaking. The coffee sat untouched, steam curling from the cup like a ghost. "Please leave," I whispered. Vanessa hesitated, glancing at Ryan. "Maybe we should—" "Now," I said louder this time. "Leave." Ryan stared at me for a long moment, then stood his chair, scraping harshly against the floor. "We'll be back," he said, his voice flat. "You'll see, this is for your own good." They walked out together, their shadows stretching long across the porch as the door closed behind them. The moment the silence returned, I sagged against the wall, clutching my chest. My whole body was trembling. Then the phone buzzed again on the table. "They're planning to declare you incompetent tomorrow. Don't panic. I have proof. Meet me at 3 Saussure at the corner cafe. My name is Stephen Callahan. Your husband hired me." For a long time I just stared at the message, the words glowing against the dark screen. Then slowly the fear inside me began to turn into something else. Resolve. If Edward had trusted this man, then maybe there was still a way to fight back, to bring the truth into the light, no matter how deep my sons had buried it. And for the first time since Edward's death, I wasn't afraid to face them anymore. The next morning rose cold and unnervingly still. The sky was the color of ash, and even the birds seemed hesitant to sing. I barely slept the night before. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Ryan's face calm, polished, predatory, and heard his voice repeating, "We'll have to take legal steps." By noon, I was pacing the living room, checking the clock every few minutes. 3 o'clock couldn't come soon enough. The message from the man who called himself Stephen Callahan replayed in my head, "Your husband hired me. I have proof." Proof. That word had become my lifeline. At 2:30, I dressed carefully, not because I cared how I looked, but because I needed to feel composed. I chose my lavender dress, Edward's favorite, and pinned my silver brooch to the collar. My reflection in the mirror looked like someone else older, harder, but alive with purpose. When I arrived at the cafe, the place was half full. The smell of burnt coffee and cinnamon filled the air. A man sat alone in the back booth just as the message said he would, tall, gray-haired, wearing a brown coat and glasses that made him look more like a professor than a private investigator. He stood when he saw me. "Mrs. Collins." I nodded, my throat dry. "You must be Mr. Callahan." "Please," he said, gesturing for me to sit. "Stephen." I slid into the booth, my hands wrapped tightly around my purse. "You said my husband hired you." He opened a folder and placed it on the table between us. "He came to me 3 weeks before his death, said something about his sons didn't feel right. He was afraid not just for himself, but for you." My breath caught. "He told you that?" Stephen nodded solemnly. "He suspected they were pressuring him to change his life insurance. He didn't know how far it would go, but he wanted documentation just in case." He pulled out a small recorder and pressed play. The sound that came out nearly broke me. Edward's voice, steady, familiar, achingly alive. "Stephen, if something happens to me, it won't be an accident. My sons, they keep asking me about money. They say it's for Maggie's security, but I can feel it. There's something darker behind it." I covered my mouth, tears welling up before I could stop them. The voice I'd missed every day since his death now filled the space between us. Stephen waited until the recording ended before speaking again. "That was 2 weeks before the hospital called you. But there's more." He played another clip, a man's voice this time cold and detached. "It was Ryan. We can't wait any longer. The old man's starting to suspect. The methanol works fast and it'll look like a stroke. By the time anyone figures it out, it'll be too late." My body went cold. I felt my heart pounding so loud I could hear it in my ears. Stephen's eyes softened. "There's another one," he said quietly, and pressed play again. Ethan's voice joined his brother's. "I'll handle Mom after. Once Dad's gone, she'll be easy. We'll make it look like depression. Who's gonna question a widow who lost her husband?" My hands shook so violently I had to put the cup down before it shattered. My sons, the boys I had carried, fed, loved, were planning not just one murder but 2. For a long moment, I couldn't speak. The cafe noise faded to a hum. I felt suspended in time, as though the world had tilted and refused to right itself again. "They killed him," I whispered finally. "They poisoned Edward." Stephen nodded. "Yes. The hospital report listed heart complications, but I've seen the toxicology results. Methanol poisoning, a slow, deliberate method. Someone must have convinced the attending doctor to falsify the death certificate." I swallowed hard. "They bribed him." "Exactly. But now we have enough to expose them. The recordings, the financial evidence, the falsified insurance documents, it's all here." He tapped the folder. I looked at the pile of proof and felt both vindicated and hollow. Justice had a strange way of feeling like grief all over again. "What do we do now?" I asked. "Go to the police, tonight, before they can move against you. They were planning to meet with a judge tomorrow morning to start the incompetency claim. If they succeed, they'll control everything, your money, your house, your freedom." The thought made me dizzy. "Then we move tonight," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. Stephen nodded. "I'll go with you." We left the cafe together at dusk. The air was biting cold, the streets already shadowed by the sinking sun. He drove us to the Pine Hollow Police Department, the same building where Edward had once renewed his business license, where we'd gone together to report a stolen bike when Ryan was 10. Inside, I asked for Sergeant O'Connell, an old family acquaintance who had known Edward for years. When he appeared, I barely recognized him, older, grayer, but the same kind eyes. "Margaret," he said, surprised. "I'm so sorry about Edward. What brings you here?" I placed the folder on his desk with shaking hands. "I need to report a murder," I said, my voice barely more than a whisper. "My husband's." O'Connell's expression shifted from sympathy to disbelief, then to grim focus. "Tell me everything." For the next 2 hours, Stephen and I laid out every piece of evidence: the recordings, the forged signatures, the falsified death certificate, the bank withdrawals, the insurance increase. The more we spoke, the tighter the sergeant's jaw became. When we finished, he leaned back and exhaled. "Jesus Christ, I never thought I'd say this, but I believe you. We'll need to exhume Edward's body to confirm the methanol, but these recordings alone are enough to get warrants." He stood, grabbed his radio, and called the district attorney. "We move tonight," he said simply. As I left the station, I looked up at the night sky, the same one Edward used to stare at from our porch, saying the stars looked like God's way of leaving the lights on. For the first time since his death, I felt him there, steady and close. Justice was coming, and this time I wasn't just the grieving widow. I was the storm they never saw coming. At dawn, I stood by the kitchen window clutching a cup of coffee that had long gone cold. Outside, a thin fog blanketed Pine Hollow, softening the world in a pale, ghostly light. The silence before justice felt heavier than any grief I'd ever known. At exactly 7 o'clock, police sirens broke the stillness. They echoed across the town, a sound both terrifying and liberating. I watched as 2 patrol cars rolled down the road, stopping first at Ryan's house, then at Ethan's. My heart pounded against my ribs as if trying to escape. It was happening. By mid-morning, Sergeant O'Connell knocked on my door. His face was drawn, but there was relief in his eyes. "They're in custody," he said quietly. "Both of them. We also found the doctor who falsified the report. He confessed to taking the bribe. For a moment, I couldn't move. The news didn't bring joy, not exactly, just a deep, aching quiet inside my chest. I sank into the nearest chair, hands trembling. "So it's over," I whispered. O'Connell hesitated. "The legal part is only beginning. But yes, the danger's over. You're safe now. Safe." The word felt strange in my mouth, like something I hadn't tasted in years. That afternoon, the town buzzed with whispers. People peeked from behind curtains, stunned that the Collins brothers, once admired for their success, were now accused of their father's murder. The small cafe where I'd met Stephen became a local rumor mill. By sunset, the story had spread across every street. When the arrests aired on the evening news, I turned off the television halfway through. Hearing my son's name spoken in the same breath as homicide was too much to bear. Stephen came by later that evening, bringing dinner I barely touched. "You did the right thing," he told me softly. "Edward would be proud." I nodded, staring at the untouched plate. "Doing the right thing doesn't always feel right, Stephen. Sometimes it feels like tearing your own soul apart." He didn't argue. He just sat with me until the house grew quiet again. The trial began 2 months later. Every seat in the courthouse was filled, neighbors, reporters, even strangers who wanted to witness what they called the tragedy of Pine Hollow. When Ryan and Ethan were brought in wearing orange prison uniforms, my heart broke all over again. They looked smaller somehow, stripped of arrogance and ambition. I searched their faces for the boys they'd once been, the ones who used to bring me dandelions and call me mommy. But those boys were gone. The prosecutor's case was merciless. The recordings, the financial records, the toxicology results, it was all laid bare. The evidence was impossible to deny. When it was my turn to testify, I stood in front of the courtroom, trembling but unbroken. My husband worked every day of his life to give us everything I said. He believed in his sons, believed they'd grow up to be good men. He was wrong, but I can't stop loving them. I just can't forgive them. Ryan lowered his head, tears sliding down his face. Ethan wouldn't look at me at all. The jury deliberated for 6 long hours. When they returned, the courtroom fell silent. On the charge of first-degree murder of Edward Collins, the foreman read, "We find the defendants guilty." The air left my lungs in a shuddering exhale. The judge sentenced them both to life in prison without parole for 30 years. The words rang through the courtroom like a bell, tolling for something greater than punishment, for loss, for love, twisted into something monstrous. When it was over, I didn't cry. I walked out of the courthouse into the cool spring air and felt for the first time in months that I could breathe. 6 months passed. I donated Edward's life insurance to a foundation helping victims of family crimes, money too stained by blood to ever touch again. I lived quietly tending the garden behind our house, turning his workshop into a small greenhouse. Then one morning, a letter arrived from the state penitentiary, Ryan's handwriting shaky, uneven. "Mom, I don't expect forgiveness. I just need you to know I'm sorry. We lost ourselves. We thought money would fix everything, but it destroyed us. Tell Dad I'm sorry too." 2 days later, the warden called. Ryan had taken his own life in his cell. When they buried him, I stood beside the grave in silence. I didn't bring flowers. There were no words left to say. Ethan, broken by his brother's death, was transferred to a psychiatric facility. Sometimes he sends me letters full of apologies and scripture. I read the first few, then stopped. Some wounds must be allowed to scar. Now, years later, the house has grown peaceful again. The garden blooms brighter, each spring roses, hydrangeas, sunflowers that Edward once loved. On Sunday mornings, I visit his grave with a cup of coffee and talk to him as if he were sitting beside me. I did what I had to. At my husband, I tell him, I found the truth. And sometimes when the wind passes through the trees just right, I swear I can hear his voice low and steady saying, "You were brave, Maggie. You saved us both." I close my eyes, let the wind brush against my face, and finally, after all the betrayal, the pain and the loss, I feel what I've been chasing all along: peace.